I'm 57 now, and I've been married to the woman I once called the love of my life for 26 years. Let's refer to her as Emma. She wasn't just my wife. She had been my friend from college. We'd known each other for a solid decade before we even got married. For the first 2 years, we were just friends. But then I decided to make a move and spend another year pursuing her romantically. The years we shared after that were filled with moments I thought would last forever. But life threw us a curveball. We ended up living in different cities for several years because of work and other official stuff. Even with the distance and time apart, Emma and I stayed close, or at least that's what I believed. She wasn't only my wife or the mother of our kids. She was supposed to be my best friend, someone who had been there for me since college. She knew me better than anyone, so when she betrayed me, it felt like my entire world came crashing down. Just last week, we attended our college reunion, an annual event to mark 35 years since we graduated. It's a huge affair with celebrities, musicians, the works. Everyone looks forward to it. This year, Emma and I were particularly excited because we were one of those rare couples that actually met in college and stayed together all these years. We walked into that room brimming with pride, eager to show off our solid marriage. I had no idea that this day would change everything for me. It was great to reconnect with old friends after so many years. The atmosphere was lively, filled with laughter, and we were soaking it all in, thinking we were on top of the world. Then, out of nowhere, someone walked in that stirred up memories I'd rather have left in the past. His name? Let's call him David, a guy from our college days who had always had his eye on Emma. Back then, Emma was the type of woman who drew people in with her wit and charm. I wasn't the only one smitten by her, but David was a different story. His obsession with her was more intense than most. He spent those college years chasing after her, even though she wasn't interested. And even when Emma and I got together, he didn't back down. I didn't let it bother me, though. I was confident in our relationship. I knew Emma loved me, and frankly, David's little attempts to win her over seemed pretty laughable. I remember when he finally found out that Emma had chosen me. He sent me this ridiculous message, basically telling me that she'd made a huge mistake and that I'd better take good care of her. Emma and I laughed it off. After that, we didn't hear from David again, and I assumed he'd moved on like any normal person would after 35 years. But here he was again at the reunion, acting like no time had passed. When he greeted us, we responded politely, but Emma seemed uneasy and opted for a handshake instead of a hug. His stare, this unsettling, intense look, was enough to make anyone uncomfortable. Sensing the tension, I tried to steer the conversation in a different direction. I asked David if he had brought his family along. That's when he casually mentioned that he'd been married for a short time, but was now divorced. I gave him the usual polite response, saying I was sorry to hear that. His reply caught me off guard, though. You should be sorry. After all, you're the one who stole my true love. He laughed like it was some kind of joke, but it was obvious there was bitterness behind it. If I'd been younger, maybe I would have taken the bait and gotten into a fight over such a stupid remark. But at my age, I just wasn't interested in such petty nonsense. David's bravado didn't rattle me, and honestly, no one in the room took him seriously. He was one of those guys who talks a big game but can't back it up. Everyone heard what he said, but no one reacted. The awkwardness hung in the air like a fog, but we all chose to ignore it. Emma, though, she wasn't as good at brushing it off. Her silence spoke volumes. Laura, a close friend of ours from back in the day, could see that Emma was upset. She pulled her aside, and the two of us tried to cheer her up, telling her not to let David's pathetic behavior ruin the night. Emma's always been the type to overthink things, so we knew we needed to calm her down before she spiraled. Just as we were trying to get her to relax, David appeared out of nowhere, like he'd been eavesdropping on our conversation. To our surprise, he actually apologized. But then he added, I didn't mean to upset you, Emma. I just wanted to remind you that, despite everything, you still have an admirer, even if time has taken its toll on your looks. That was it. I felt my blood boil. How dare he insult her like that? But I kept my cool. I told him firmly to leave us alone. Emma, too, told him to back off. David, though, wasn't done. He kept pushing, asking for forgiveness so that we could all enjoy the rest of the night. David's words hit me in a way I wasn't expecting, making me realize maybe it was time to let go of the past. This evening marked the end of reconnecting with old friends and classmates, and it made me see how pointless it is to keep hanging onto old baggage. Realizing that, Emma hugged David, telling him it was time to let go of whatever they had in the past and not come looking for her again. She was pretty firm about it. After that, Emma and I made our way to the dance floor, ready to enjoy the night. The mood was light, people joined in, and the whole evening turned into a real celebration. A little while later, I noticed Emma chatting with Laura, while David was standing nearby, acting all animated and dancing in a goofy way. I wasn't thrilled to see him still hovering around, but at least it seemed like the earlier tension had eased, and I thought we could move forward with a sense of closure. I kept a close eye on Emma throughout the night, just to make sure she was okay. I couldn't help but notice David whispering something to her. It made me uneasy, but when I saw Emma respond with a smile and a nod, I figured it couldn't be anything serious. If he'd crossed a line, Emma would have told him off. She's never been one to hold back. Feeling more at ease, I relaxed and spent time catching up with old friends, enjoying myself. But as the evening wore on, I started to notice something odd. Emma and Laura had both disappeared. At first, I didn't think much of it. People were mingling, and I figured they were off somewhere talking. But as more time passed and neither of them came back, my worries started to grow. I tried calling them, but with the loud music and chatter, I wasn't surprised they didn't answer. Still, I was getting anxious. After about 30 minutes, Emma finally reappeared, but something was off. She looked the same, but her behavior had completely changed. She was quiet, distant, and suddenly insistent on leaving the event. Laura came back too, but the two of them didn't exchange a single word. The silence between them was thick, and it didn't take a genius to figure out that something had happened. I kept pressing Emma, trying to get her to tell me what was wrong, why she was so determined to leave early. But she shut down, refusing to explain. I didn't want to cut the evening short, but Emma wouldn't let up, so we left. On the drive home, the silence stretched on. I kept asking her what was going on, but all she'd say was that she was tired and needed to rest. That wasn't like her at all. Emma's normally full of life, not the type to get worn out so easily. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I even asked if Laura was somehow involved, but Emma snapped back with a curt no, offering no further explanation. At that point, I realized I wasn't getting anywhere, so I gave her some space. But as we drove, my mind kept racing. While our old classmates were probably still partying, posting pictures online, and reliving memories, I was sitting there with this heavy sense of dread. I knew something had changed, and not for the better. When we got home, Emma slipped into bed quietly, pretending to fall asleep almost immediately. I stayed up a while, lost in my thoughts. I finally crawled into bed around 2 a.m., exhausted but restless. I must have only been asleep for a little while when Emma shook me awake, sobbing. Her tears poured down, and she clung to me like I was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. I wrapped my arms around her, gently rubbing her back, trying to comfort her. I asked if seeing our old friends had stirred up some emotions, but she didn't say a word, just kept crying. I didn't push her. I knew sometimes words aren't enough, so I just held her close, letting her know I was there for her, no matter what. Eventually, the tears slowed, and that's when she dropped a bombshell I never saw coming. Emma admitted that she had cheated on me, and not just with anyone. She cheated with David. I couldn't even speak. I was frozen, completely blindsided. My mind raced back to the reunion, to all the little moments I had brushed off. The way David had been around her, the dancing, the conversations. Everything that seemed harmless suddenly felt like pieces of a puzzle I had ignored. When Emma had come back from that party with that grim expression, pushing for us to leave, it all made sense. Laura had known too. That explained why she had acted so strange, avoiding eye contact, barely speaking. I stayed quiet, unable to move or think straight. Emma must have sensed my shock because she decided to spill the whole truth. She told me that while they were dancing, David had apologized to her for putting her in an awkward position after all these years, for not letting things go. He complimented her, talking about her strength and all the qualities he still admired. Then, David confessed that even though he'd been all over the world, He had never met anyone like her. His words worked on her, and she admitted that she enjoyed the flattery. She said it made her feel something, and that's when David asked her to go for a walk with him. He promised it would be their last encounter, a chance for him to say everything he'd been holding inside. At first, Emma refused, but he kept pressing, telling her it was a chance to hear his unfiltered thoughts. And, well, curiosity got the better of her. She agreed to go, needing to know what he had to say. So, the two of them went for a walk around the quiet, familiar campus, the same place where we had built our history together. As they walked together that night, David poured out his feelings, telling Emma how he had always loved her, claiming she was the most extraordinary woman he'd ever known. Their conversation wandered through different topics, but the essence was the same, his undying affection for her. Emma admitted she had been drinking, which made her more vulnerable to his smooth talk, and she foolishly let herself get swept up in it. At some point, David took her hands in his, complicating things even further. Emma's emotions were all over the place, and she broke down in tears as she confessed to me what had happened between them. She didn't hold back, recounting every painful, intimate detail. Each word felt like a knife, twisting deeper into my heart. She told me how, in a moment of guilt, she finally came to her senses and pushed David away, ending whatever had begun. I sat there, stunned, unable to respond. I needed space to process what she had just told me, so I asked for some time alone. But Emma, still in tears, kept begging me for forgiveness. In an attempt to calm her down, I suggested she rest, telling her we could talk more in the morning. As she clung to me, terrified of losing what we had, I lay there with my eyes closed, trying to sort through the mess in my mind. The events of that night kept playing over and over until one moment stood out like a neon sign. I remembered David's smug, almost triumphant smile when Emma returned from their walk. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. But now, looking back, I realized it was a victory for him. He had finally broken through. That realization filled me with a fury I hadn't expected, and any pity I had for myself was quickly drowned in disgust. Sharing a bed with Emma felt impossible after that. Once she finally cried herself to sleep, I quietly slipped out of bed. I packed my essentials, a laptop, my wallet, some clothes, into a backpack, all while trying to keep my emotions from overwhelming me. As I stood there, looking at the woman I had loved for 26 years, I realized something gut-wrenching. Despite everything, I still loved her. Our marriage had given us a family, a lifetime of memories, and a bond that felt unbreakable. But no matter how strong that bond was, I couldn't stay. Emma knew me too well. If I waited until morning, she'd find a way to talk me out of leaving, and I wasn't strong enough to resist her persuasion. So, I left. I found refuge in a hotel and, as a precaution, I blocked her room number and removed her from all my social media accounts. By the time the sun came up, exhaustion finally took over, and I fell into a deep sleep. I didn't get to rest for long, though. By 8 a.m., my phone was ringing nonstop. Our kids, completely in the dark about what had happened, were calling, trying to reach me. Emma and I have 2 children, a 24-year-old son and a 21-year-old daughter, both currently studying at the same college. As I sat there, groggy and disoriented, I realized I hadn't really thought about how to handle this situation. Pretending everything was fine wasn't going to cut it. After all these years, Emma was my best friend, the person who knew me better than anyone. Lying to her, or to myself, would have been pointless. The calls from the kids kept coming, and I knew I had to talk to at least one of them. I decided to call my son, figuring he'd be the calmer, more level-headed one. My heart felt heavy as I told him the truth. His mother had cheated on me the night before, with someone from her past. I couldn't sugarcoat it. David wasn't just an old admirer. He was practically a stalker. I told my son I needed time to figure things out, to process everything. The shock in his voice was palpable. He couldn't believe what he was hearing, that his own mother could do something like this. I could feel the weight of it in his silence. Our family had always been admired for its closeness, for the love we shared. Friends, relatives, even our kids looked up to us. Now, all of that had been shattered in a single night because of Emma's betrayal. My son struggled to make sense of it, repeatedly asking if there was some sort of misunderstanding between his mother and me. I could hear the desperation in his voice, the need for answers. But I knew that giving him a detailed breakdown of the night's events would only make it worse, would only deepen the wound. So, with a heavy heart, I told him I wished it was all just a cruel joke. But it wasn't. His mother had confessed to everything. Though he was 24 and old enough to have dealt with heartbreak before, this was different. This was a betrayal of trust within our family, something that cut much deeper. I asked him to promise me he wouldn't tell his sister or anyone else until I was ready to deal with it. I didn't want this situation spiraling out of control. To keep things simple with our daughter, I told her I'd be out of town for a while on business, using work stress as an excuse for my absence. That seemed to do the trick, and the calls stopped. Now, I was left alone with my thoughts. The reality of what had happened was sinking in, and I wasn't sure how to move forward. While my daughter believed I was away on a business trip, my son and Emma both knew the real reason. I had left. Over the next few days, I buried myself in research, looking up top divorce lawyers and trying to figure out the best way to deal with everything. During one of those late nights, I stumbled across a subreddit where men shared their stories of betrayal, heartbreak, and how they dealt with unfaithful partners. Some of those stories were filled with anger and revenge plots, but that wasn't something I could bring myself to consider. No matter how deeply Emma had hurt me, I couldn't bring myself to hate her. The truth was, I still loved her, and it would be a lie to pretend otherwise. But love alone wasn't enough to repair what had been broken. The trust between us was gone, shattered beyond repair. I knew, no matter how much it hurt, that we couldn't go back to the way things were. Our paths had diverged, and there was no reconciliation in sight. I wrestled with how to move forward. So many things needed my attention. Work, our children, and the practical aspects of splitting up our lives after decades together. Tomorrow, I have a meeting with a lawyer to go over the legal details. Emma and I had both been management consultants earlier in our careers, but we quit our stable jobs in our 40s. She pursued her passion for writing, and I started working as a business consultant, mostly with startups. Since I'm self-employed, I don't have a fixed office, and I started thinking about the possibility of Emma showing up at one of the places I work. But then I realized, with my work being spread across multiple clients and locations, it wouldn't be easy for her to track me down. Emma hadn't managed to find me yet, and given the nature of my work, it wasn't likely she would. Still, the thought crossed my mind that, with us approaching our 60s, we had talked about retiring soon. We had even planned to buy a beach house, somewhere peaceful in the countryside. A place we could escape to and enjoy our golden years. We'd been saving for it, and had already looked at potential properties. Now, I'm just thankful we hadn't gone through with the purchase yet. If we had, things would be a lot messier. Meanwhile, Emma kept trying to reach me, constantly calling, but I needed space. I spoke with the lawyer, and he advised me to inform our children about the separation, something I knew would be hard for them to process. He also brought up the issue of dividing our property, and initially, I thought we'd split everything 50-50ths. But after some reflection, I realized I didn't want to punish Emma by taking away her fair share. She had contributed just as much to building our life together as I had. She deserved her half of the property, but she also needed the separation she had brought upon us. Knowing her as well as I did, I knew Emma would be willing to give up her share if it meant trying to reconcile, but I had already made my decision. As the divorce papers were being prepared, I decided it was time to sit down with our children. I asked my son to discreetly bring my daughter to a restaurant without letting her know I'd be there. When she saw me, her reaction was immediate and intense. She bombarded me with questions, asking if I had cheated on their mother or if something else had happened to make me disappear from their lives like that. It was heartbreaking to see her so upset, but I had to keep calm for their sake. I reassured her that I hadn't been involved with anyone else and, slowly, I began to explain what had happened. My son already knew some of the details, but this was the first time my daughter was hearing the full truth. She was completely unprepared for what I had to say. When I told her that Emma had cheated on me, her world collapsed. She had been staying with Emma during the 15 days since I left, completely unaware of the real reason behind it all. Tears filled her eyes as she hugged me tightly, apologizing for any anger or bad feelings she might have had toward me. In that moment, both my children begged me to consider giving our marriage another chance. They wanted to believe there was still hope, but I couldn't. As painful as it was to see them cry, I had to stay firm. They understood, eventually, just how deep the wound was and that I needed to take care of myself too. I assured them both that the decision to separate had nothing to do with our love and support for them. That would never change. My daughter, still heartbroken, expressed her worry for Emma. She said their mother had been struggling, barely eating, barely sleeping. Since I'd left, she'd gone from sobbing to pacing restlessly, and she had been calling me nonstop, desperate to talk. Emma had even shown up at my clients' offices, searching for me, only to be told I hadn't been there in weeks. Sensing her mother's desperation, my daughter had asked Emma directly if something had happened between us, if there was more to the story than she knew. Emma didn't respond. She just cried, unable to give an answer. Overwhelmed by the silence, my daughter had retreated to her room, where she tried to make sense of everything, but the sadness was too much to bear. Realizing how hard all of this was on my kids, I asked my daughter to stay home and be there for her mother as we went through the divorce. As the days passed and we talked more about Emma's betrayal, I could see a change in my children. Their initial sadness slowly shifted to anger. They felt betrayed, too, by the mother they had always admired. The pain from the breakdown of our family weighed heavily on all of us, but the blame for this destruction, I knew, lay squarely on one side. Even though Emma had caused so much hurt, I was determined not to let our children grow to hate her. Instead, I urged them to support her during this difficult time. Despite everything, she was still their mother. But what came next truly caught me off guard. A few days later, I got a message from David. He had the nerve to ask about Emma, saying that if I was divorcing her because of her affair, he'd be more than willing to step in and take my place. I couldn't believe his audacity. I told him, in no uncertain terms, that Emma was free to make her own choices, and then I blocked him. I wanted nothing more to do with that man. Strangely, his message didn't fill me with the anger I might have expected. I wasn't going to let him manipulate me or twist the knife any deeper. I had never been married to David, never loved or trusted him. My pain was rooted in my connection to Emma. That's why her betrayal cut so deep. It wasn't about insecurity. It was the emotional wreckage she left behind that haunted me. If Emma wanted to continue with David, that was her decision, but it didn't matter to me anymore. The divorce papers were set to be delivered today, and I found myself anxiously waiting for my daughter to call and tell me how Emma had reacted. In the meantime, I had plenty of other things to deal with, dividing up our assets, planning for retirement, and making sure my children were taken care of. Time passed, and it was a stressful, exhausting process, but I can finally say that the divorce is official. When Emma received the papers, the reality of the situation hit her like a freight train. She had been living in this fantasy, convinced that my anger would eventually fade and that we'd somehow reconcile. But once those documents were in her hands, the bubble burst, and she realized I wasn't coming back. Emma kept asking for a meeting before signing the papers, hoping she could talk me out of it. And the truth is, she probably could have. If I had agreed to see her, I might have been swayed by her charm and the connection we once had. But I knew better. I had to put my emotional health first, no matter how conflicted I felt. Even though I still loved her deeply, I couldn't ignore the damage she had done to our family, or the respect I had lost for myself in the process. Emma had taken me for granted, and that realization hurt more than anything. As much as I wanted to save her from the spiral she was in, I couldn't keep living in the toxic environment she had created. My daughter called me shortly after, and the news she shared weighed heavily on me. Emma had been hospitalized due to depression, unable to cope with everything that had happened. On top of that, the financial strain from her actions had fallen squarely on her shoulders, reinforcing my decision to step away. Emma wasn't taking care of herself. She refused any medication or supplements and had to switch to a liquid diet because her health had deteriorated so much. I know some people might look at how I handled things and think I'm heartless, that I'm selfish for not rushing back to help her. They might even question whether I ever truly loved her. But those people don't understand the pain of betrayal. It's hard to put into words how much I loved Emma. She wasn't just someone I adored. She was the center of my world. I worshipped the ground she walked on. For almost 3 decades, she wasn't just my wife. She was the mother of my children, my partner in everything, my soulmate. David, in his own twisted way, was right about one thing. Finding someone like Emma is rare. She was brilliant, talented, compassionate, all the things anyone could want in a life partner. And I treated her that way. I tried to be the best husband I could be, but her actions showed me that the love and trust one gave her weren't returned. That's what hurt the most. It wasn't about feeling insecure. It was the emotional devastation of being betrayed by the one person I thought would never hurt me. If Emma wants to continue her relationship with David, that's her choice. It doesn't concern me anymore. As the divorce papers were about to be delivered, I waited anxiously for my daughter's call, hoping to hear how Emma reacted. Meanwhile, I had to tackle the pressing issues at hand, dividing our property, planning for retirement, and ensuring my children's well-being. These things needed careful thought and resolution as I tried to lay the groundwork for what my future would look like. What took me by surprise was Laura's reaction. She didn't seem shocked at all. In fact, she claimed she already knew why Emma and I had separated. Curious, she started calling me, trying to piece together how I had discovered Emma's affair. I told Laura that Emma had confessed to her infidelity. Laura apologized, explaining that she had warned Emma to stay away from David and not to spend time alone with him. But Emma ignored her advice, and here we were. Laura then shared her side of the story, and it was different from what Emma had told me. According to Laura, everything started while they were dancing, Emma, Laura, and David. Laura said David was whispering in Emma's ear, making advances, which cast doubt on Emma's claim that he was merely apologizing. It was unsettling. Laura seemed frustrated, and she admitted that she had tried to intervene when she noticed Emma seemed to be enjoying David's attention, which only raised more questions about Emma's true feelings. When David suggested going for a walk, Emma had turned to Laura, silently asking for advice. Laura, knowing David's history, strongly urged her not to go, warning Emma about his manipulative nature. But despite Laura's warnings, Emma agreed to the walk. Laura, busy talking with friends, didn't immediately realize Emma was gone. When she finally noticed, she became worried and started searching for her. What she found was unexpected. Emma and David weren't just walking on the lawn like Emma had claimed. Laura found them together in the college pool locker room. That was when it all clicked for me. Emma hadn't pushed David away because of guilt. It was Laura's interruption that had stopped them. It was hard to process. Even though Emma had admitted her mistake, the whole story wasn't what she made it out to be. She had made a conscious decision to go with David. That realization hit me hard. After hearing Laura's version, I couldn't help but ask myself if there was any chance of forgiving Emma and giving our relationship another shot. I was torn. On one hand, Emma had confessed, and I respected her for that. But on the other hand, Laura's revelations added layers of complexity. Emma's deception left me emotionally raw, and I was still trying to understand the depth of it all. At the same time, my kids were sharing news with me about Emma's deteriorating mental health. She had fallen into a deep depression, and there were even signs she might be hurting herself. I couldn't help but feel some responsibility for her well-being, even though I had every right to distance myself. Concerned, I asked Laura to visit Emma and try to have an honest conversation with her, hoping it would help Emma confront her truth. I needed Laura to make it clear to Emma that I now knew the full story and that reconciliation wasn't an option. My priority was Emma's safety. I didn't want her to hurt herself any further, even if we weren't going to be together. Emma had held on to the hope that I would come back, but Laura's visit made it clear to her that I had moved on. Emma eventually signed the divorce papers, and though it wasn't easy, it was a relief to know that part of the process was over. With everything that had happened, I found new motivation. Instead of settling down like I had planned, I felt the need to go in a different direction. I decided to start fresh, embarking on a solo journey to explore new experiences and free myself from the weight of the past. The thought of escaping the responsibilities of a permanent home brought me a sense of peace, something I hadn't felt in a long time. I know I'm not handling everything perfectly, but I'm doing my best in these uncertain times, just hoping I can make it through. A year has passed, and I wanted to share an update on how things have unfolded. Time moved slowly after I left the house. I stayed in a hotel for a few months, then rented an apartment while the divorce worked its way through the courts. I continued working, but I shifted to clients that allowed me to work entirely from home, which gave me more flexibility and helped me adjust to my new life. When it came to dividing our assets, Emma received half of the money we had saved for the retirement home. It was tough to part with that money, but I understood that a fair split was necessary. To make sure the remaining 50% was put to good use, I decided to split it between our two kids. They're both adults now, and I know those funds will help them as they continue to build their own lives. As for Emma, she's still in therapy, working through her emotional issues. Laura has stayed in touch with her and occasionally checks in on me as well. During one of those conversations, Laura shared some new information about Emma that caught me off guard. I'm careful about how I handle this, given that Laura is still supporting Emma, but I'm willing to listen and hear her out. It turns out, despite what I thought, there were reasons to question just how well I really knew Emma. I always saw her as strong and determined, but maybe loneliness had a bigger impact on her decisions than I realized. From what I've learned, Emma started reconnecting with David, and he initially reciprocated her feelings. Their relationship seemed to flourish, at least until David found out about our impending divorce. That's when things changed. Once David learned about the divorce, he distanced himself from Emma, leaving her feeling confused and heartbroken. She reminded him of the affection he had shown, but David brushed it off, admitting that he only saw their relationship as something casual. He had no interest in a long-term commitment or marriage, especially not with someone as strong-willed as Emma. This revelation devastated her. She had believed David's sweet words, only to realize that his intentions were shallow. It's hard for me to imagine Emma begging David for something more serious, especially given his reputation for being insincere. But that's exactly what happened. When David revealed that he only wanted a physical relationship and nothing more, it crushed Emma. He even boasted about having achieved his goal, smugly claiming he had outsmarted her. That was the final blow. Emma realized too late that she had fallen for his lies, and it left her feeling humiliated. A couple of weeks ago, I got an update on Emma. My daughter had been living with her for the past year, trying to offer support while Emma struggled with depression after I left. But it became too much. After a year of trying to hold things together, my daughter had reached her breaking point. Emma had changed completely. She had gone from being strong and independent to someone who was filled with insecurity, constantly needing attention and validation. She became unpredictable, swinging between hysteria and deep depression, which put an enormous strain on everyone around her. It was painful to hear. This was not the Emma I had known for nearly 3 decades. Her actions and emotional turmoil had taken a serious toll on her well-being, and it became impossible for my daughter to continue living with her. Emma's mental state had deteriorated to the point where she became controlling, especially with our children. She would call them incessantly, and if they didn't respond immediately, she would spiral into panic. When my daughter tried to talk to her about this behavior, Emma would break down, terrified that she was losing them, just like she had lost me. Emma's fear of abandonment was overwhelming, and although my kids assured her that they wouldn't leave her, they were running out of ways to help her. Her erratic behavior was becoming too much for them to handle. She would get into heated arguments with them, accusing them of not being there for her in her darkest moments. This wasn't the Emma we had known, and my children were struggling to recognize their mother in the person she had become. 2 weeks ago, after yet another argument, my daughter decided it was time to leave. She had done all she could to support Emma, but she couldn't put her own life on hold any longer. And I couldn't blame her. It was important for her to move forward, just as it was crucial for Emma to start taking responsibility for her own life. As much as one might expect someone in my position to feel some satisfaction seeing their unfaithful ex-wife suffer, I couldn't feel anything but sadness. Emma had made terrible decisions, and those decisions had led her to this point of suffering. I felt no joy in watching her life unravel. I just hoped she could find a way to recover some of her former self, regain her confidence, and maybe even rebuild her strength. Over the past year, I've been on quite a journey of my own, literally and figuratively. I've traveled to 4 different countries, immersing myself in new cultures, enjoying local food, and experiencing life in a way I hadn't expected. When I first left, I was disappointed that my retirement plans I had made with Emma, had fallen apart. But I've come to see this as an opportunity, a chance to explore the world on my own terms. I've met incredible people along the way, and these experiences have been eye-opening. I'm not currently in a relationship, and I'm not actively seeking one either. I'm just letting life take me where it will. In the past 2.5 years, I've traveled to over a dozen countries and even rekindled my passion for painting, something I had lost touch with over the years. It's been a journey of self-discovery, and I'm still figuring out what's next. Last month, after 4 years apart, I reunited with Emma. The reason for this unexpected meeting was our son's upcoming wedding. He had found his life partner, and 2 months before the wedding, he wanted Emma and me to meet his fiancée's parents. I was hesitant at first, thinking we should just meet at the wedding itself, but eventually, I agreed. It wasn't about me. It was about being there for my son. A week before the wedding, the bride's parents graciously invited us to dinner. I was reluctant but decided to attend at the last minute. It was tough seeing Emma again after all this time. I would have preferred it to just be the two of us, away from all the formalities. But life doesn't always work out the way we want it to. But I knew I had to be there for my son, and both he and his fiancée were thrilled to see me. Her parents made a great first impression. They were warm, hospitable people. When I met her father, it was like we clicked instantly. We had a long conversation about his business, but I'm sure you're more interested in how things went with Emma, so let's get to that. The moment I walked into the room, I noticed Emma seemed uneasy. There was a clear change in her, a tension in her eyes. She wasn't the same woman I had once known. Though she smiled politely, it was obvious she had distanced herself from me over the years. Despite that, she still had her long hair, a feature that had always been part of her personality. But I couldn't ignore the toll the past 4 years had taken on her. It was more visible than I had expected. As we sat at the table, it became clear that my son hadn't told his fiancée's parents about the details of our past. This was the first meeting between both sets of parents, and while I was curious about how that would play out, I didn't expect it to cause any issues. At first, Emma was quiet, keeping to herself in the group. But when she found a moment to speak to me alone, she commented on how much healthier and more energetic I looked. I nodded and told her I had removed all the toxic elements from my life. She seemed momentarily taken aback by that and glanced around to make sure no one else was listening. She then asked if I was seeing anyone romantically, but I sidestepped the question, telling her it wasn't any of her business. I kept the conversation short, and for the rest of the evening, I focused on engaging with the other guests instead of her. When the night finally came to an end, I said my goodbyes to everyone. As I was leaving, I simply nodded to Emma and told her to take care of herself. That seemed to surprise her, and she stood up abruptly as I said goodbye to the others. Though things happened quickly, I don't think it appeared awkward to anyone else in the room. All in all, the interaction with Emma was surprisingly straightforward. It seemed like she was startled by my presence, or maybe just too uncomfortable to have an open conversation. Whatever she was thinking, I wasn't interested in digging any deeper, and I left the gathering without giving it much more thought. As I was about to head out, my son walked me outside and invited me to stay with him for the next few days. I appreciated the offer, but I had to decline and promised him I'd call soon. The truth is, I don't have a permanent place of residence anymore. I travel constantly, and when I'm back, I usually stay in hotels. It wasn't easy adjusting to a nomadic lifestyle after spending 26 years as a family man, but over time, I've come to appreciate the freedom it brings. There's more to share. 2 years ago, during a trip to Tokyo, I met a woman named Catherine. She's 52, and like me, she was coming out of a difficult situation, having just left an abusive relationship. We met while hiking up a mountain, and what started as a casual encounter quickly turned into a deep friendship. At the time, neither of us was looking for romance, and we took things slow, enjoying each other's company without any expectations. After my time in Tokyo, I planned to travel to South Korea, while she was heading to Thailand. But we kept in touch, and over the next few months, our friendship grew stronger. Eventually, we decided to travel together. Over the past year and a half, we've explored more than 8 countries together, building a close bond as travel companions. We didn't rush into anything romantic. We spent the first 2 months of our travels maintaining a platonic relationship by mutual agreement. We wanted to get to know each other deeply, without any pressure. My kids knew about Catherine but chose not to tell Emma, worried that it might trigger her depression. When I got back to my hotel after dinner with my son, I called him to explain why I didn't take him up on his offer to stay with him. I told him Catherine was with me on this trip, and it wouldn't have been fair to leave her alone. I also mentioned that I wanted Catherine to attend the wedding as my partner. My son liked the idea but was worried about how Emma might react. I understood his concerns, but I stood my ground. It was important for Catherine to meet my family, and I wasn't going to hide our relationship. I suggested my son talk to my daughter about it, and thankfully, she supported the idea. With just a week left before the wedding, Catherine and I spent our days exploring Kentucky, giving her a tour since it was her first time visiting. We enjoyed the time together, and I was glad she could experience this part of my life with me. When the wedding day finally arrived, I couldn't help but notice Emma's intense gaze as Catherine and I walked hand in hand into the venue. I had been cautious about how Emma might react, but her look said it all. She hadn't expected to see me with someone else. Before the event, I had warned Catherine about the possibility of Emma acting out, but she assured me she could handle it with grace. Still, it was in that moment that I realized just how much control Emma still had over me, even after all this time apart. As soon as Emma saw us together, she rushed toward me, grabbed my wrist, and tried to pull me aside. I stood firm, telling her I wasn't interested in having a personal conversation. Emma was relentless. She asked me directly if Catherine was my girlfriend and if I planned to marry her. I responded sharply, making it clear that my personal life was none of her concern. By now, other guests had begun to notice the scene she was creating, her tears and anger drawing unwanted attention. I asked her to leave us alone. The wedding was about to start, and her behavior was ruining the atmosphere. My daughter tried to intervene, hoping to calm her mother down, but Emma resisted, stubbornly refusing to listen. We begged her to stop, pointing out how her actions were disrupting such an important day for our son. But Emma didn't care. She raised her voice, showing no concern for the situation or the people around her. What happened next took me completely by surprise. My daughter, who was usually so soft-spoken, finally had enough. With a strength I hadn't expected, she stepped up and gave Emma a stern lesson, one that had been building up for far too long. My daughter reminded her that this was supposed to be a family celebration, but Emma's choices had betrayed that idea. She presented her with two clear options: either accept the situation and move on, or be escorted out of the wedding. There was no room for negotiation. In that moment, I realized I didn't need to protect my daughter. She was perfectly capable of standing her ground. She delivered her words with such conviction, pointing directly at Emma, as if to make sure the message fully sank in. I could feel Emma's grip on my wrist tightening, but then she let go. We locked eyes, and I saw a mixture of anger and betrayal in her trembling face. After a few moments of silence, Emma turned and left, not even acknowledging Catherine. What happened next surprised me even more. My daughter, showing maturity beyond her years, walked over to Catherine and apologized on Emma's behalf. Catherine, with her usual warmth, embraced both of us, and I couldn't have been prouder of my daughter's resilience. I called her my soldier, a term that made her visibly emotional, and I could see how much it meant to her. Emma had caused so much pain over the years, always expecting sympathy from certain friends and leaning on others for support. But her choices had fractured our family. My children didn't even have a family home for special occasions anymore, and I had to admit that was partially my fault. Throughout the rest of the wedding, Emma's isolation became more apparent. She distanced herself, standing in corners or sitting alone, far removed from the celebration. She even refused to join the family for photos, making it clear just how far she had fallen from the role of the groom's mother. A few days after the wedding, Laura called me to let me know that Emma was upset, angry that I was moving on with my life while she remained stuck in her loneliness. I told Laura that both my children and I had reached a point where we could no longer bear Emma's constant drama. I explained that Emma was on her own path now, and she was free to live her life however she wanted, but my goal was to find peace and enjoy the years I had left. I was also considering being more present for my children, creating a stable home for family gatherings, even though they were now grown. The wedding made me realize that a new chapter was beginning, one where I might soon be a grandparent. I had no intention of informing Emma about this, and I felt content with that decision. Laura also shared that Emma's mental state had worsened. She was behaving erratically, having panic attacks, and seemed completely lost. I asked Laura to stay with her and offer whatever support she could, while I reached out to my daughter. Unfortunately, my daughter was away, and Laura couldn't stay with Emma for long. That left Emma alone in the house, and in her fragile state, it was a recipe for disaster. The next day, everything fell apart. My children and I received devastating news. Emma, in the midst of a mental breakdown, had run out into the road and was hit by a motorcyclist who couldn't stop in time. The mother of my children, the woman I had once loved more than anything, was killed instantly. It's hard to even talk about it. Her body was so badly injured. It was as if she had been shattered like a broken doll. Part of me can't help but feel some guilt. Did bringing Catherine to the wedding push Emma over the edge? But deep down, I know we couldn't have continued living under Emma's manipulations forever. It all started with her betrayal, and the tragic path that followed was her choice, not ours.